to learn how to invest in the stock markets, how to invest in gold or gold miners or Bitcoin or equities or property or any other type of investment. I'm here to teach you about investing your money so that you can prepare your own financial future and your retirement. And one of the things you may have noticed from some of my recent videos is I sometimes tell a little story. In the middle of the video, it's a story which is quite often unrelated to the video in question of being an investment manager and a wealth manager over the last 50 years. For example, if you watch some recent videos, you might have heard the story about the Black Widow. That's the lady, very sexy and beautiful lady, who perhaps was a husband killer and managed to entice me into her apartment when she was dressed like a prostitute. And then there was that story of this very hot French housewife who had me sat down in the kitchen while she was sitting on a high stool in a mini skirt. So watch my previous videos if you want to hear these stories, but there's a nice story coming in the middle of this video. But let's get back to the question of $15,000 gold. It sounds impossible, right? But this plan is not only possible, it's been done before, and I think it's in the making as I make this video. And the key to all this is gold. We're talking about a potential revaluation of the US government's gold holdings from the statutory price of $42.22 to $15,000 an ounce. Today, I'm going to break down how this could happen, who gets rich, why the whispers about this plan are getting louder in the highest circles of power, and how you can know when it's about to happen and prepare yourself. The United States government owns a lot of gold. It's about 261.5 million ounces, to be exact. But here's the crazy part. On the official books of the government, this gold is valued at just $42.22 an ounce. That's the statutory price of gold set in 1972. The gold thus has a book value of only 11 billion US dollars. But at today's market price of about $3,300, that same gold is actually worth over $862 billion. And if gold were to be revalued to $15,000, that gold would be worth over nearly $4 trillion. But let's go back in history a little bit. Where did this gold come from in the first place? Currently, it's held by the US Treasury, which is a branch of the US government. But it wasn't always theirs. Back in 1934, in the middle of the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act. This law forced the Federal Reserve, who held the gold, to hand over all of its physical gold to the US Treasury. The Federal Reserve got a piece of paper, an IOU called a gold certificate. If you look at the Fed's balance sheet today, it's the very first asset listed on the balance sheet. It's called Gold Certificate Account, and it's valued at that same $11 billion. But it's just an accounting receipt. It's not a claim to get their gold back, ever. The Federal Reserve cannot and may not convert that certificate into gold, and it has no right to ask for redemption of the certificate. So the only way it can be redeemed is if the Treasury so decides, and if they redeem it, they'll redeem it at the statutory price of gold, i.e., which is $11 billion. So that gold certificate is on the books as $11 billion. It's only worth $11 billion, and it never will be worth any more, and it can't even be cashed in, at least not at the holder's behest. So we go back to 1934. All that gold was transferred from the Federal Reserve to the Treasury as a result of the Gold Reserve Act. But Roosevelt wasn't done on that day. The next day, he devalued the US dollar by over 40%. He did this by changing the official price of gold from $20.67 an ounce, or more precisely, as it was worded in his proclamation, he reduced the gold weight of the dollar from 25.8 grains of gold, 9/10 fine, to 15.715 grains of gold, 9/10 fine. Obviously, we know it today as an increase in the price of gold from $20 to $35. Now, this genius move at the time, created a £2.8 billion paper profit out of thin air, that all profits should revert to the Treasury of the United States for the benefit of the country as a whole. And with that, the Fed was left with a bit of paper and nothing more. Obviously, their real gold was now gone. The move shocked bankers in London, Paris, and Zurich. The mighty US dollar that they held had suddenly lost 41% of its value overnight. Foreign bankers saw it as an aggressive, unfair trade tactic. It was a clear signal that the old rules of money no longer applied. So why am I talking about something which happened 90 years ago? Because today, the USA is facing a similar crisis. The national debt is spiraling out of control. The interest payments alone are becoming one of the biggest expenses of the entire federal budget. The government has to refinance about $9 trillion of its debt over the next 4 years. That's roughly 1/3 of its debt. This debt was issued when interest rates were low, about 1.5% to 2%. Today, interest rates or yields on bonds are closer to 5%. That refinancing cost, which is coming over the next few years, is going to cause the government's interest costs to explode. Something has to be done. And that's where the 1934 playbook comes into focus. A revaluation of gold to $15,000 would generate $3.9 trillion of windfall for the Treasury. It would wipe out the entire budget deficit for 2025 or 2026 when they do it, and it would allow the government to pay down a huge chunk of the national debt. So how would this work technically? Because it's a kind of monetary sleight of hand, but it can be done in 4 simple steps, which I'm going to outline. And I'm not asking for any Nobel Prize for explaining this. First, the Treasury would buy back the gold certificates held by the Fed. Thirdly, the Treasury now sell all of its gold to the Federal Reserve at the new price, the new statutory price, receiving in exchange $3.9 trillion of newly created digital cash. And finally, the government would repeat the 1934 trick, which is to pass a new law forcing the Federal Reserve to hand over that gold back to the Treasury in exchange for, you've guessed it, another gold certificate. The end result: the Treasury's got its gold back, plus it's got $3.9 trillion in cash created out of thin air, $3.9 trillion in cash created out of thin air by the Fed. And since the gold certificates aren't counted as government debt, the national debt could be drastically reduced, and, of course, in the current year, there'd be a huge profit made by the Treasury, resulting in a... So who wins in this scenario and who loses? Well, the biggest winner, by far, is the US government. But the other beneficiaries would be anyone who owns gold, or anything related to gold, such as gold mining stocks. Central banks in countries like Russia and China would see their assets soar. Individuals who own gold coins or bars would see their wealth multiply. And of course, gold mining companies would become incredibly profitable overnight. Now, probably you're thinking this just benefits the rich. And at first, you're absolutely right. I mean, let's consider Scott Bessent. He's the Secretary to the Treasury, one of the most important positions in the country. He has a say in what will happen. But before he was Secretary of the Treasury, he was the founder of a major hedge fund called Key Square Group, which had exposure to gold mining stocks. And before that, he was part of George Soros's team, the man who broke the Bank of England by betting against the pound. So taking big bets is something that he will know all about. Now, whilst he's probably divested himself of these private interests, probably as a requirement of becoming, taking office as Secretary of the Treasury, his public statements are what are most interesting. And this is where I get the information to say that remonetization of gold, probably at $15,000, is under consideration as I speak. So what Scott Bessent has said, he has talked about the need to monetize, and I'm using words he used, monetize the asset side of the US balance sheet. Now, if you're a financial insider, you know that's a clear code phrase for revaluing gold. Whilst he didn't use the exact phrase revalue gold in the context of the US balance sheet, the single most undervalued and readily monetizable asset on the balance sheet is the nation's gold reserve. It's crystal clear that when he says monetize the Treasury's assets, he must be talking about gold. There is nothing else that can be monetized. You can listen to me, and then you can go and do a Google search or ask ChatGPT to check what I'm saying is true. And then you can choose to take action or not to take action. But just remember, those are the exact words of the most important person in America when it comes to the soundness of the United States finances. And the way to monetize gold, or rather, let's say the way to monetize the Treasury's gold, is simply to repeat the 1934 sleight of hand. So how likely is this to happen in the near future? Well, any plan this big would have to be kept top secret until the very last second. So you won't see it announced in the news beforehand. But there will be signs. The only advance warning you might get is a rapidly rising gold price and a falling dollar, without any obvious explanation. That could be a signal that insiders, immoral, illegal, unjust, unfair, whatever, prices often move before a major announcement, and there's very rarely any prosecution. But here's my little story that I promised you at the beginning. And since we're talking about insiders knowing what's coming in advance, today's story is all about that, about a man perhaps on the inside. It's a true story. So back in the early 80s, I was in my 20s, and I was working in the trust department of a major bank in the Cayman Islands.